the books that I read for the last 40 years. And today I have my special guest exploring decision making, clarity, self leadership, and system of power, grounded insight from live experience inside high control systems. And of course, the author of several books, none other than Miss Patty Bear. Welcome, Miss Patty, on Book One on Review. And can you please introduce more about yourself that I miss?
Yes. Hello. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'm a retired airline captain. I spent 35 years flying, first in the military and then in the airline, and retired as a Boeing 777 captain. As you mentioned, I'm the author of 4 books. And what you probably don't know is that I grew up, what you can see from one of the books, I grew up Old Order Mennonite, which is like the Amish. The Amish, the big difference between the Amish and us was they had electricity and they drove horse and buggies. But aside from that, we drove black cars and we couldn't have movies or television, couldn't wear jewelry or makeup, and couldn't vote or serve in the military. And so I ended up in the military anyway. So it was a kind of an unusual path out of that. And I tell that in my memoir.
Miss Patty, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and wisdom too. Very well. Thank you. And today let's talk about the writing process of all your books. You grew up in a cloistered world of plain people of Pennsylvania, where women were expected to be silent, submissive, and obedient. Writing a book requires claiming your voice. What was like emotionally, physically, spirituality to sit down and write when every cell of your upbringing told you your story did not matter?
Well, so it was a very interesting experience, and that was my second book, which was actually helpful because I had experience already at writing and that process, which anybody who's written a book knows, or anybody who's really done a big venture. The first time is an entire learning experience. But still, that was pretty writing the memoir about that experience of leaving that world and all the things that happened um, because part of what happened is that my family and the church culture and the controversy around it ended up in the national news. So my father was in front page of the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Boston Globe, Canadian television. I think he was on Good Morning America, and it was a pretty searing experience. And so I went back to write about what had happened from the inside, what the public didn't know. And so that's kind of, finding your voice in that uh, when you have been kind of discouraged from telling your story. It was a little nerve wracking. It got easier as I went along, and then it was difficult to revisit some of the moments that I hadn't thought about in a long time that I had grown up with, because there was violence and there was a lot of uh, stories that weren't true in the news, stories that my father told, um, and court cases and things like kidnappings, things like that, that were um, hard to write about. And part of what I had to do was to go back, and some of the things I couldn't remember what order they happened in. So it was really helpful for that book to go back and do the research in the newspaper articles and then to piece it together. And putting that narrative together really helped me, um, I think, reconcile the story, is what I would say.
Indeed, to reconcile the story itself, your first book, From Plane to Plane, chronicles your escape from centuries old culture through national scandal that played out in New York Times, People magazine, and Good Morning America before you wrote it. You had to live it. How did surviving the public exposure prepare you or make hesitant to expose yourself again on the page?
So say that last part again, please. How did
Yes.
it do what?
How did you surviving that public exposure prepare you or make you hesitant to expose yourself again on the page?
Oh, okay. Good question. I think it came up. You know, when you're writing the book, you're always at liberty to not publish it if you want to, right? And so that's um, part of what I reminded myself is I could write everything down. I could write the story, and when I was done, I could decide whether I wanted to publish it or not. I could decide what to do with it. Um, and of course, I knew in writing that my father wouldn't be very happy about the story that was told. So that was a little nerve wracking. And then the other thing is that when the book came out, then I was on radio shows and things like that, and it was live, and it was having been in the news before. That was kind of and having had it been traumatic, that was a little. I was a little worried at first what that experience would be like. But it was kind of fun talking about the book, and I got used to it, and so it it healed a lot of that part of it as well.
Indeed. Yes, indeed. You live multiple lives: Mennonite child, Air Force Academy graduate, Gulf War aircraft commander, international airline captain, and now an author. Which version of you showed up to write the first sentence of your memoir? And did she have the fight other version of control of the keyboard?
Did I have the control of the book, of the
Yes,
version?
please.
Yes, I
Yes.
did. It was really, really important to me that, um, so maybe that's the captain, right? I decided what I was going to write, and I decided how I wanted to frame the book. And for me, I had um, two main objectives when I thought about the book. What I wanted to, uh, I think when you tell a memoir, you're telling a portion of your life story, but you're telling it for a reason. Like you have a framework for what that is for the memoir. Like why are you telling this story? And for me, it was two things. One, I wanted to correct the record. There had been a lot of misinformation um, in the original telling. There was a public story, and then there was a private story, and I wanted to tell a private story that what was behind the scenes when these things were happening in the newspapers, when those front page newspapers went live, what was happening behind the scenes, what was the real story. But the second thing was I wanted to tell a story of how I had come out of that world and gone into another world, because it was a very unlikely story. Like the culture that I grew up in, women had one path. Like you grew up. I had ancestors on both sides for hundreds of years that you grew up in that church. You stayed in that church. I would have grown up to wear the long dresses. It was just like a uniform. All the women wore the same dress. I would have grown up to wear that dress and the white cap and the black bonnet, and done um, lived the same life as all the generations of women before me. But because of what happened, because of the interruption of the scandal, um, it it made me think about whether I wanted that life or not, which I probably wouldn't have. So I was 8 years old whenever everything kicked off, and I began to look around me at the difference between what I was told and what was true, what a lot of people call reality testing. And from that, I began to look and make other plans. And I didn't know how I was going to get out of the world. I just knew that I wanted to make my own money, and I didn't want to be financially dependent. And so, part of the reason for writing that book was describing what I call the call of the wild soul, the ways in which human beings have sort of a destiny path, and you get sometimes you volunteer to leave your neighborhood, sometimes you get pulled out, but something in you calls you to the life that you were born to live. And so that was the second part of the book that I wanted to make sure was spoken about.
Speaking the call of the wild soul, your path of liberation began as a child and become what you called following the call of the wild soul. When you ride, did you feel the same wild soul showing up? What does it feel like in your body when you are writing from that place versus writing from obligation?
So it feels like a river runs through you. I never have writer's block. And it also feels like demanding. It feels there's a certain amount of pressure in it. So my first book, House of the Sun, um, I was talking to my sister about this gifted teacher that my children had, and then hers had, and was retiring. And she said somebody should write a book about it, and I said, yeah, somebody should, right? Because she just had a way with children, and I thought it should be written down, but I didn't think anything more about it. And then for 3 weeks, I couldn't get this out of my head, and I just kind of rolled my eyes. I was like, oh, I'm going to have to write this book, aren't I? Because so that's what it feels like sometimes. Like I think initially, sometimes it feels like this lovely invitation, like, oh, let's experiment, let's try this out. Sometimes it is a very demanding force like that. But there's for me, and I'm sure that different people experience it differently. But for me, it can be an inspiration, it can be a demand, an urgency. Sometimes it's just one thing leads to another. It's a path of breadcrumbs. It's a synchronicity. Something opens up that you hadn't considered before, and you're like, "Oh, I guess that's it." So it's both a wonderful feeling. It feels like you are connected to a muse, and it can also be a tough taskmaster.
Miss Patty, you've said your escape was catapulted by scandal your father initiated that captured national attention for more than a decade. How did watching your family story play out in the media shape your understanding of narrative of who gets to tell the story and wow?
Wow, that's a wonderful question. It it did. I think it played a key part for sure in writing my book, because it really bothered me that my father's narrative was um, accepted without question. And I'll give you an example. He besides kidnapping my sister and my brother, for which he was never charged, he kidnapped my mother from a public place, and there were witnesses, and the police were called, and there was a trial. Then there was a criminal trial, and he admitted in court that he had planned this for several days. It was intentional, and and that he wasn't sorry. He would do it again. But he also had he also cried to the jury, and he had a reason for why he did this, and they let him off, despite the fact that there were witnesses, despite the fact that he admitted that he had intentionally committed this crime. And so that was just pretty flabbergasting to see the it was a lesson in how people who are good storytellers can fool the public, even in the presence of concrete evidence. And it was also a good lesson in paying attention to those details. So if I'm hearing a story, or if I'm um, seeing a narrative, paying attention, well, what are the details that would dispute the story, or what doesn't add up, and who else the other person in the story, what else might they say? Um,
Beautifully articulated, Miss Patty. You serve as an aircraft commander in the first Gulf War and become an international airplane captain, commanding a multi-million-dollar aircraft with the lives in your hands requires immense discipline. How does that discipline translate to the page? Do you approach a book projects like a flight plan?
So, a lot of people have asked me, do I sit down every day at the same time to write? Like, do I make a discipline of it? And I know that's recommended for a lot of writers, and a lot of famous writers recommend that. Um, I I don't necessarily do it that way, mostly because writing comes easily to me. Um, in terms of, as I mentioned before, I don't have writer's block, but I do sit down, and what I do is I just I just sit down and put pen to paper, and then the discipline comes back. It comes in editing and going through that process, and then of course in marketing. But I don't treat writing so much like a flight plan. But I would say the one parallel is this: when I write, what I find with my books, there's always something that I'm trying to clarify for myself. So I'm writing. I go through a process where I gather a lot of information, and then I sort of digest it. I'm trying to figure out what is the core, what is the essence of it. And for instance, in the first book, House of the Sun, I wrote about 600 pages trying to put some simple framework to what this teacher did, that I then threw out, because the 600 pages, it was all part of the process. It was part of getting clear. But it wasn't the final draft. So there's a discipline in that, I think, in understanding, you may have worked at it for 5 years, but it's either right or it's not. It either is, and you can, for me, I can kind of feel in that process, have I got down to rock bottom? Have I got to the essence? And I don't stop until um, I can feel that alignment on the page that says, yes, this is clean. This is the essence of it.
Miss Patty, you've been featured in major media for decades. How has being interviewed shaped your understanding of what readers want to know, and how is it influenced the way you shape stories on the page versus in conversation?
I think that, so in conversation, with like on a podcast, or with where there's a particular theme, I think you have to think about. For me, I think about, I want to collaborate with the person I'm speaking with, right? So I think about, well, what is their interest, and where do they enter the conversation, and where does some part of my book or my work or what I'm passionate about interact with theirs? And my hope is that when that happens, if it's a good collaboration, it should be something that is greater than the sum of our two parts. Like, it should bring some dynamism to the conversation, and we both should learn something. I should learn something from the conversation, even if I'm, something from the back and forth. And I always hope to bring something that the listeners, that it'll be something new, something that maybe a listener hasn't heard before, maybe something that um, liberates them in some way. It always gives me a great deal of joy to share something that brings clarity for someone else, um, that might help them feel in some way some sense of freedom, or a greater sense of agency or power.
Well, Miss Patty, thank you so much for your legacy to the world. Your books will be a testament for your legacy. Your Wisdom Hacks book offer 20 tools for clarity, direction, and self leadership. When you look back at the young woman escaping her Mennonite childhood, what's one tool you wish she'd had, and are you giving it to the readers now?
Gosh, that's a good question. Which one tool do I wish I'd had as a child?
Yes, please.
Well, one of the ones that I love is Dreaming is Free. And it's this sense that, we can think, oh, I can't dream of something because it might not be possible for me. Or we can go and we dream of something that is fantasy, right? But when I talk about dreaming is free and wisdom hacks, it's the idea that allow yourself to imagine things that you don't know how to do, that you might want, and it doesn't cost you anything. It's like you can go out and you can play, and you're in that space where um, it's all free. And but a lot of things in life are a jumping off point from your imagination. And if you can retain that childhood sense of play and imagination and dreaming, it can take you out of your neighborhood. It can take you out of stuck places, and you're just giving your mind a place to play and a place to roam free. So I think that's one that I used as a child and would use again.
Beautifully articulated, Miss Patty. Your story includes national scandal, public attention, and very visible escape. How do you navigate the vulnerability and putting your truth on the page while knowing that the world, including people who live through it with you, will have access to it?
Yeah. So, what was that last part of what you said? That people living through it will have what?
Will assess.
Will assess it.
Yes.
Um, so it's a it's a it is a kind of a delicate question to tell the truth. One of the things to tell the truth, to not tell more than you have to do to tell the story or to get the point across. And then one of the things that was really important to me is I have 5 brothers and sisters, right? And they were all children when this took place, and they were a crucial part of the story because I couldn't tell the story without telling what happened to them because each of them had some significant incident that happened. But I wanted to, so I was careful to tell only the incident. And I say in the foreword of it that I told the story about what I witnessed, but I tried very hard not to tell their stories because that's not my story to tell. So I think you have to make a distinction between what's your story to tell. And sometimes that can be hard because there are people who will tell you you don't deserve to tell your story because um or you shouldn't tell your story because it might hurt somebody's feelings, or it might um somebody else might not like it or whatever. But so I tried to be careful about telling my story, knowing why I was telling my story, what the purpose was, and sharing details that um, illustrated that story, but not more than that. And then I also, for the story, I also offered each of my brothers and sisters, even though they had already been mentioned in the newspapers, I asked them if they wanted a pseudonym in the book, and um, so that they weren't subject to any sort of publicity again.
Miss Patty, you've graduated from the Air Force Academy, served in combat and commanded aircraft. You have also written books. When you think about legacy, do you think about your service record on your bookshelf first? And what does that answer tell you about yourself?
I don't think about a role like that. I don't think about either serving in the military or, while I'm proud to have served my country, I don't think of that as the particular legacy, nor do I necessarily think about being a captain as a legacy. What I think stands out as a legacy for any person, what you leave behind when it's all done is not accomplishments. It's your character. It's what kind of example did you leave? How did you live your life? And I think that's the essence that you leave behind. And it's what I try to put in my books.
Well said, Miss Patty. And to wrap up our discussion for today, you've called your path the call of the wild soul. If a reader pick up one of your books and feels that wild soul steering in themselves for the first time, what was the one thing you hope they are take away about what's possible for their own life?
Yeah, I think that walking the path of the wild soul is kind of a narrow edge path. It's one of courage, it takes adventure, but it'll lead you places you never would have guessed. And you want to use discernment on it. But if you begin to hear that, all I would say is pay attention. Listen, hear what it's saying and see where it takes you.
So, Miss Patty, thank you so much for sharing your books to the world. Thank you for sharing your knowledge and wisdom as well. So, can you please invite our listeners to support all your books?
Yes, you can find my books on Amazon, Books a Million, Barnes and Noble Online, bookshelf.org, and you can find my website at theflyingclub.com.
Yes, people, let's support Miss Patty because if you support her, for sure, more and more empowering books like this to rise. I have one more question, Miss Patty, if you don't mind. Your father initiated
Not
the
at all.
scandal that catapulted you out of your childhood world. How was your relationship with your own story and with him?
So my relationship with my own story was in writing the book. There's something about when you come from a trauma background where it's very disorganized. It can feel chaotic psychologically and just what happened when. And so writing the book um, helped me to define that narrative, which is very healing. Um, for someone who has a background, in terms of my father, he was never going to be thrilled about the real story told about him, right? And that was just part of what I had to come to terms with. I had a good relationship with him for 30 years, as good as you can with someone who is, um, has those kind of behavior issues, and they continued well into his 90s. That didn't change. But I think that it is helpful to. I think that when we hold people who behave in abusive ways accountable, I think it's good not for just for ourselves, but I think it's also good for the other person. It's not helpful for them to be allowed to get away with things and to think that it's okay. And so I think there's a healing aspect in that, whether the person enjoys it or not. I think it serves a purpose for that as well.
Miss Patty Bear, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Likewise. Moticon people, see you soon.